Greetings. I'm delighted to welcome you to the second lecture of our new series, Arts at Graham. My name is Emily Lynn Osborne, and I am the Interim Dean of the Graham School of Continuing Professional and Liberal Studies. I am also a professor in the Department of History here at the University of Chicago. If you came in a bit early, you should have heard two blues songs, one by Bessie Smith and the other by Ma Rainey. August Wilson, who you will learn more about soon, was greatly inspired by the blues. He described it as music that breathes and touches. But before we turn to Wilson, a few explanations and introductions are in order. On the format of this presentation today, this is a webinar, so you are not able to use your microphone and your camera is turned off. We are recording this event so that we may post it online for people to watch at a later date. You are able to communicate with the moderators and ask questions of our speakers through the question and answer box. We encourage you to do so. Professor Warren and the respondents will be taking questions from the audience at the end, after Professor Warren's talk, and again at the end. We will not be able to answer all of your questions, but when one of the moderators does ask a question, we will read your name. I also understand there are people from far afield who are attending this webinar this evening, who from outside of the Chicago area and even from outside of the United States. So if you'd like, you can also indicate from where you are tuning in. You'll find the button to open the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. For those of you who are new to the University of Chicago Graham School, I want to extend you a particularly warm welcome and tell you very briefly a little bit about ourselves. We are the University of Chicago's continuing education school, and we offer a range of classes and courses of study through the liberal arts. Our courses are now fully remote and available online. Our faculty and instructors are dedicated to promoting camaraderie and community through learning, and our students are not afraid to pursue profound, critical questions about the human experience. It is from this commitment to humanistic inquiry that we partnered with cultural institutions across the university to launch this series, Arts at Graham. The pandemic has closed communal spaces of congregations that we know and love, movie houses and theaters, museums, bookstores, and performance halls. And so we thought we could creatively bring together faculty and staff from the University of Chicago with our Graham students, friends, and family to explore various forms of human expression and culture. This week, we do so in partnership with Court Theater. On Tuesday, our first Arts at Graham event focused on Leopoldstadt, the latest play by Sir Tom Stoppard, with a talk by Professor David Levine. Today, we do so with Professor Ken Warren. Professor Warren is the Fairfax Cone Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of English. He has published widely on literature and its relationship to political and social change, a focus that shapes his study of Ralph Ellison, So Black and Blue. He has also conducted research on the relationship between Jim Crow and African American literature. At the University of Chicago, he teaches courses on realism in American literature and on genre, the politics of race, and the relation of culture to politics. The respondents to this talk are Charles Newell, or Charlie, who is the Marilyn F. Vitale Artistic Director at Court Theater. Charlie has directed numerous plays, the most recent being Rex in the 2019-20 season. He has won numerous honors, including the Stage Directors and Choreographers Foundation Zelda Fickhandler Award, which rewards outstanding transformative directors for their creativity, artistry, and influence on the arts. Our second respondent is Ron O.J. Parson, he is a resident artist at Court Theater. At Court, he has directed 8 plays from August Wilson's Century Cycle, including Headley 2, Fences, The Piano Lesson, and Jitney, as well as a number of other productions, such as Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, and Clark Peters' musical, Five Guys Named Mo. Parson has also performed at the Steppenwolf and Goodman theaters and acted in several television series and films. As you can well imagine, this season of pandemic has been extremely difficult for Court Theater, the University of Chicago's professional theater. Plays are hard to produce, perform, and watch during the reign of a pandemic, when we are advised to stay home and maintain social distance. Devoted, occasional, and even rare theater goers should not despair, however. This season, Court presents a reimagined season that features conversations and talks with faculty and professionals who will lead their audience through deep dives into the worlds of production, playwrights, and performance. In short, if you are interested in continuing the conversation about August Wilson, you may do so by taking a Court Theater seminar led by two of the presenters here, Ken Warren and Ron O.J. Parson. One more introduction is also in order. My fellow moderator is Joel Rohn. Joel is a fourth-year graduate student in the Department of English, where he studies historical representation, civil rights nostalgia, and identity discourse in African-American letters after the Cold War. And with that, I turn this digital lecture over to Ken Warren.
Good evening. By way of beginning, I'd like first to thank Emily Osborne in her role as interim dean of the Graham School for the invitation to stage today's conversation with Ron O.J. Parsons and Charlie Newell about August Wilson. I'd also like to thank the staff of both the Court Theater and the Graham School for helping with the technological setup. Without that, I would not be able to speak to you today. So thanks for the wonderful job there. Emily has already done a great job introducing Ron and Charlie, so I won't have to add to her appreciation of their many accomplishments, except to say that I could hardly imagine a couple of interlocutors more suited to discussing the question of for whom is August Wilson than the two of them. And as for how I plan to proceed this evening, I will first give my lecture. And given that I know that so many in the audience are zoomed out, I apologize in advance for not having anything more fancy than a lecture to offer. But I promise not to go on for an extended amount of time. And then once I've finished, I'll ask for a few questions if there are any pertaining to my talk. And then I'll bring in Ron and Charlie, who will either take up some of the questions that I've already posed for them or perhaps raise some of their own. And after that, we'll have time for more questions from the audience and we'll attempt to respond to them to complete our evening. And so now to begin, as for August Wilson, I'm sure no introduction is needed for most, if not all, of you listening and watching tonight. Of a handful of playwrights, including Sam Shepard, David Mamet, Tony Kushner, Susan Laurie Parks, Adrian Kennedy, a list that's probably, as I've given it, embarrassingly dominated by male writers, who most define the ambitions of serious theater in the US over the latter decades of the 20th century. Wilson, beginning with the play Jitney, which was first produced in 1982, and then ending in 2005, which was the year of Wilson's death with the play Radio Golf, not only conceived of, but brought to completion one of the major literary and theatrical projects of our time, the production of 10 plays, each representing a decade of the 20th century, which purported to represent the distinctiveness of the lives of Black Americans. Known as his Pittsburgh or Century Cycle, Wilson's plays, which in addition to Jitney include Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, set in 1927 and premiered in 1984, Joe Turner's Come and Gone, set in 1911, premiered in 1988, Fences, set in 1957, premiered in 1987, The Piano Lesson, set in 1936, premiered in 1990, Two Trains Running, set in the 1960s and premiered in 1991, Seven Guitars, set in 1948, premiered in 1995, King Hedley II, set in the 1980s and premiered in 1999, Gem of the Ocean, set in 1904 and premiered in 2003, and as I said, Radio Golf, set in 1990 and premiered in 2005. These plays brought into their orbit a host of prominent actors, directors, including Viola Davis, Charles S. Dutton, James Earl Jones, Felicia Richard, and Alfre Woodard, to name a few. And on a melancholy note, we could also add Chad Boseman, whose passing we are all mourning currently, who will be appearing in a version of Ma Rainey's Black Bottom through Netflix shortly. These plays have earned numerous awards and nominations for Wilson, including a playwright, as well as for his many collaborators. And although a lot can be said about the scope and depth and even the limitation of each of these plays, and I hope our discussion will include some comments about at least a few of them on our way to our consideration of Wilson this evening, it will be through Wilson's declaration, "The Ground on Which I Stand," which originated in June of 1996 as his keynote address to the Theater Communications Group Conference, that we will take as our starting point for our discussion of Wilson. This address, which I hope some of you have had the opportunity to reread or to read for the first time, prompted a great deal of controversy and debate, including most prominently a pointed rejoinder by theatrical critic, producer, and playwright and writer Robert Brustein, which was titled "Subsidized Separatism," which in turn led to a 1997 debate between Wilson and Brustein, sponsored by the American Theater magazine, titled "On Cultural Power." And that's a debate, if you're interested, you can find recordings of it on YouTube. Indeed, it was Brustein who had in part provoked Wilson's complaint in his keynote by charging in an article that foundation and government funding for theater and arts had increasingly substituted sociological criteria for artistic criteria in awarding support for theatrical artists, with the result that artistic excellence had been sacrificed for the pursuit of social and political ends. Warning against what he called tribalism and separatism, Brustein felt that these initiatives limited the talents of individuals in favor of what he saw as less legitimate and certainly less artistic group concerns. So what were Wilson's concerns in response to Brustein? Well, among his most uncontroversial complaints was the decided lack of sufficiently resourced art theaters devoted to producing serious plays by Black writers, which is to say, plays like those that Wilson was writing. Wilson noted that of the 66 theaters represented by the League of Resident Theaters, LORT, only one could be characterized as a Black theater. More controversially, Wilson blasted the funding imperatives and criteria adopted by arts foundations and the government agencies, which stressed developing more diverse audiences for existing theaters, as well as adopting so-called colorblind casting, a term which refers to the practice of casting actors from all different ethnic and racial groups for roles that had in the past traditionally been reserved for white actors. Calling colorblind casting a tool of the cultural imperialist, that's a quote, Wilson alleged that placing Black actors in these roles made them, quote, part of a social milieu that denied Blacks their own God, their own humanity, and their own mores. Although Wilson readily accepted the idea that all Americans shared what he called commonalities of culture across ethnic groups, and he expressed his admiration for writers and artists who weren't Black. In fact, in a 1999 interview for Paris Review, he included Jorge Luis Borges as one of the 4 Bs that had most influenced him as an artist, the other 3 being the blues, the artist Romare Bearden, who was also a fellow Pittsburgh native, and his fellow writer Amiri Baraka. So despite stressing these commonalities of culture, Wilson said that he was most moved by the desire to assert the distinctiveness of a shared Black sensibility deriving variously from differences in experiences. Where, he asked, is the common ground in the maim of a policeman's bullet? In a question that is certainly resonant for our present moment. Locating himself unapologetically on the ground marked out by the Black arts movement of the 1960s and early 1970s, Wilson asserted his commitment to the project of Black self-definition, embraced by, among others, Ron Milner, Ed Bullins, Philip Hayes Dean, and Sonia Sanchez, As I'm sure many of you know, the Black arts, Black aesthetic movement, in which the city of Chicago played a major role, was an effort by Black writers and artists to reject and move beyond um, what had been called the two-audience problem, um, um, going back to Paul Laurence Dunbar uh, at the beginning of the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century, W.E.B. Du Bois, James Weldon Johnson, Langston Hughes, and Zora Neale Hurston. This problem, all these writers had identified as being an obstacle to true creativity among Black writers. From this point of view, the felt need to take into account what were described as white or European norms, standards, and expectations had stifled the true creativity of Black writers and artists that could only be found by diving into one's own experiences and cultural practices in a manner that was indifferent to, or perhaps sometimes in defiance of, what white audiences or white critics expected or wanted. Articulated forcefully in contributions to Black Fire, an anthology published in 1968 by Baraka and Larry Neal, and to another anthology, the Black Aesthetic, which was edited by Addison Gale in 1972. The Black arts movement sought to align itself with what it saw as the tastes and sensibilities of non-elite Black Americans. In its more strident formulations, some Black arts documents denounce the work of writers such as Ralph Ellison, the author of 1952 novel Invisible Man, who was charged with subordinating his art to European standards. Although some of the authors associated with that movement didn't agree with that assessment as well. And Larry Neal, famously, after criticizing Ellison, also acknowledged the significance of his artistry. Notwithstanding its incoherencies and shortcomings, which of course are all subject to further debate, the Black arts movement has proved to be enduring in inflecting discussion of those inequalities in American society that have emerged or continue to emerge as measures of racial disparity. The idea that whatever our commonalities with others in US society, members of the Black population in the US, can usefully be referred to as a community united by a culture or a sensibility now operates as a common sense norm for many, despite the fact that, as Cedric G. Johnson, a professor of political science and African American studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago, points out, quote, the sheer size of the Black population today should, in and of itself, render such talk of Black self-organization and Black sentiment obsolete. Johnson elaborates, at nearly 46 million, the Black population in the US is greater than the population of Canada, 3 times the population of Greece, and slightly larger than the combined population of Oceania, which is to say Australasia, Melanesia, Polynesia, and Micronesia. Why, he goes on to ask, are so many incapable of thinking about the Black population with the same complexity that they would afford those populations? Nonetheless, by way of example, recently the New York Times, in describing its decision to capitalize Black, the word Black, when describing people and cultures of African origin, asserted, quote, we believe this style best conveys elements of shared history and identity and reflects our goal to be respectful of the people and communities we cover. In addition, noting that it seems like such a minor change, I'm sorry. I made a quick change here that took out a sentence that I had in, that it seems like a minor change, that nonetheless the new term reflected the sense of shared sensibility. So across American culture of 20th century, the sentiments of the Black aesthetic movement has largely been conceded in cultural and political commentary on race. Now, this concession has not come without hiccups and objections. The year after Wilson spoke, literary scholar and critic Henry Louis Gates Jr. also published a response to Wilson's remarks in the February 3rd issue of The New Yorker titled The Chitlin Circuit. Among other things, Gates noted was a point that Harold Crews, the acerbic author of the still bracing, though highly problematic 1967 book, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, had made when considering the possibility of Black theater in the 1960s, the idea that a theater, or the observation really, that a theater consists of an array of differently situated professionals whose interests are not automatically aligned. While a call for colorblind casting, Crews noted, might not warm the heart of aspiring Black playwrights looking for residencies and financial commitments to produce their plays, it might prove a godsend to Black actors looking for more opportunities to put their stamp on major roles. So Crews, for example, in discussing the challenges that had beset the American Negro theater in the 1940s, noted, quote, the conflicting motivations of the playwrights involved, for whom a Negro theater was mandatory at that moment, and those of the actors, for whom any theater that provided work was acceptable. It followed then, as he said, that once the greener looking fields of integration in the theater downtown, outside of Harlem, that is, beckoned to the actors, the American Negro theater's all Negro theater idea would be undermined. And Gates, following suit in his rejoinder to the Wilson and Brustein debate, noted that Wilson's stand on colorblind casting has found little acceptance among working Black actors, dramatists, and directors. But the real target for Gates's intervention was the tenability of Wilson's charge that there was that Black theater truly didn't exist, because Gates insisted that such theater did exist, but that it was not the domain of theatrical masterpieces meant to speak across the ages, but rather of more ephemeral, immediate productions that were meant to speak to the concerns of the moment. In invoking the significance of popular theater in US society, Gates was raising a topic that Alexis de Tocqueville had opined on in the 19th century about the unruliness of theater in a democracy. De Tocqueville wrote, when the democratic classes rule the stage, they introduce as much license in the matter of treating subjects as in the choice of them. As the love of drama is of all literary tastes, that which is most natural to democratic nations, the number of authors and of spectators, as well as of theatrical representations, is constantly increasing among these communities. Such a multitude, composed of elements so different and scattered in many different places, cannot acknowledge the same rules or admit to the same laws. No agreement is possible among judges so numerous, who do not know when they may meet again, and therefore each pronounces his own separate opinion on the piece. If the effect of democracy is generally to question the authority of all literary rules and conventions, on the stage it abolishes them altogether and puts in their place nothing but the caprice of each author and each public. For Gates, then, what was true more broadly of American theater, as de Tocqueville described it, is also true of Black theater, that it has thrived and will thrive in defiance of, and without regard to the desires and the tenets of any would-be tastemaker, Black or white. And then Gates, in making his point, takes his reader on an ethnographic tour of the scene of this Chitlin circuit. And I don't have time here to comment on the accuracy of Gates's ethnography, which some have questioned and which we'll probably talk about a little bit later. What is nonetheless illuminating is that while it might appear at first glance that the argument between the two lions of theater, Wilson and Brustein, broke down along the line of elite versus popular, what Gates was getting at was that this was really an argument that was unfolding entirely within the domain of elite nonprofit theater. An observation that was less a problem in some sense for Brustein, who unabashedly spoke on behalf of what he took to be artistic genius and elite theater, than it was for Wilson, who in his response also sought to distance himself from W.E.B. Du Bois and his concept of a talented tenth, which is to say the idea that any cultural progress made by any group is the result of a concerted effort of the most talented members of that group. In response and in objection to that, Wilson thundered, all God's children got talent. But however much Wilson purported to represent the needs and the interests of a Black populace, his Jeremiad was directed really at the donor community and their role in setting the terms for the development of Black theater. And on this point, Gates noted that despite their differences, Brustein and Wilson are in complete agreement on the one subject that agitates them most, the disastrous nature of the donor-driven trend to diversify regional theaters. Brustein dislikes the trend, Gates observed, because he believes it supplants aesthetic considerations with sociological ones. Wilson dislikes it, according to Gates, because, as is true of all movement toward integration, it undermines the integrity and the strength of autonomous Black institutions. Thus, the debate about the importance of autonomous Black theater was actually being played out on a stage before a disproportionately white but uniformly wealthy audience of the donor class, but one that was at once less white and significantly wealthier than it had been a few decades earlier. More tellingly, Gates added, this dynamic was not a break with the Black arts past, the past that Wilson had lionized in the ground on which I stand, but rather, Gates charged, a continuation of it. Gates wrote in that piece that the dirty little secret, I'm quoting Gates, of the Black arts movement was that it was a project promoted and sustained largely by the Ford Foundation. Liberal Medicis made it. In the fullness of time, they left it to unmake itself. Although I should point out here, as I suggested above, in unmaking itself as a movement, Black arts has in some ways nonetheless become hegemonic, or at least various aspects of that sensibility. And had the spirit of full disclosure prompted Gates to take his observations about the Black arts movement even further, he would have also noted, as the scholar Noliwe Rooks discloses in her study of the rise of Black studies departments, that African American studies, Black studies, was envisioned and proposed by the Ford Foundation as a means to desegregate and integrate the student bodies, faculties, and curricula of colleges and universities in ways that would mirror the public school systems that had been ordered by the Supreme Court to free themselves separate but equal from, to free themselves from separate but equal racial education systems. So what Brustein, despite his elitism, because he, for example, disparages rap, or perhaps because of this elitism, gets right, is that regardless of where one comes down on the criteria that ought to be used to determine which playwrights, theaters, or actors receive funding, the belief that one could appreciably further the ends of social justice by promoting theater might be a grievous mistake. In his 1998 essay, Coercive Philanthropy, Brustein makes several trenchant observations on this topic that bear quoting here. He writes, for a number of years now, American culture has been asked to shoulder obligations once considered the exclusive responsibility of American politics. And this has radically altered the way we now regard the arts. The activization of culture in recent times has come about, one suspects, because legislative solutions to the nation's social problems have been largely abandoned or tabled. Aside from debates over competing healthcare programs, writing, as I say, in the late 1990s, the most significant action advanced by liberals for solving America's more urgent social needs has been to increase the cultural representation of minority groups. This state of affairs, he says, goes back to the Carter years, but it was clearly intensified during the Reagan-Bush administrations with their neglect of economic inequities and indifference to social justice. The powerful conservative revulsion against traditional liberalism led not only to a restructuring of national power, but a redistribution of the country's wealth, which is to say a redistribution of that wealth upward. While the burgeoning deficit and growing taxpayers' revolt frightened lawmakers away from passing any incremental social programs. Not only was Marxist economic theory discredited by the failure of communism, but so were the related, though considerably milder platforms of socialism, liberal humanism, the welfare state, the New Deal, the Great Society, and perhaps even more the whole construct of democratic politics. For the first time in more than 100 years, he says there exists no viable theoretical alternative to laissez-faire capitalism. And he was really describing neoliberalism with its unregulated greed and unequal income structure. No collective idealism to temper unrestrained individualism, no Marx or Keynes to dispute with Adam Smith or Milton Friedman. Not even, he says, a radical national magazine, if we discount the intellectually weakened Nation and Dissent, that still gives voice to opinion on the left. In other words, he's saying that the conflict over culture that he and Wilson were engaged in reveals the way in which cultural conflict has actually become a way of doing neoliberalism, which called for the unfettering of and the expansion of the market in a way that has allowed for massive accumulations of wealth among a tiny portion of the population, whom we then seek to prevail upon to direct a portion of their earnings to causes that serve the social good. Bruce Stein goes on to say, while this is not the place to debate the strengths and weaknesses of opposing political ideologies, he is arguing that the weakening of the political left and the absence of a genuine political dialectic has led to paralysis in an arena of social action usually serviced by legislation. It is because of this inertia that the nonprofit cultural sector, he says, is being pressed into compensatory service as a way of sustaining hopes disappointed by the political system. And concluding in a manner which I'm sure will rub some in the wrong way, Bruce Stein observes that what seems to have gotten lost in all the separatist clamor for cultural identity is that the most pressing American issue today is not race or gender or ethnicity, but rather what it has always been, the inequitable distribution of the nation's resources, which is an issue of class. This makes our concentration on culture as an open door to equality and opportunity look like a diversion from the pressing economic problems that affect our more indigent citizens. It reminds me, he says, of how in the beginning of the 50s, cultural attention was distracted from the depredations of an unregulated economy and focused on the evils of network television. So to the extent then, if we follow this line of thinking, that we allow wealthy individuals to feel they are furthering social justice by funding Black, Latinx, Indigenous, et cetera, theater and other cultural production, rather than by shouldering a significantly larger burden of taxation, we end up enabling rather than challenging inequality. And the point here is not that the wealthy shouldn't underwrite good theater, but that they should do so because they like good theater and because they believe in good theater, and not because in doing so they think they are making society a little less unjust. So ironically then, what this means for Wilson's plays, standing as examples of good theater, or rather we could say for the ways in which we view these plays, is that to the extent that we think producing or attending these plays is a way of doing social justice, we are doing the opposite of what we intend. To the extent, however, that we judge these plays, say on their artistic merits, which are many, even if one has criticisms of some of the plays here and there, in terms of their success or their failure to explore the specificity of one man's cultural experience in ways that have touched and continue to touch on the truths that matter to those who care about renewing and enriching theatrical form, then we have a chance of doing them justice. And I think we're going to hear from Ron Parson momentarily here.
As August would say, I ask that we find a common cause that can enlist us all. For in the end, it comes down to people sitting on a stage talking about life as a battlefield of the spirit, and how art and life illuminate and embolden and celebrates that battle. Finding in it a meaning for the weight and substance, the content and the context of our lives.
Thank you, Ron, for that. Actually, so before we bring Ron and Charlie back on, I think we're ready to take a few questions, if there are any.
Oh, there's plenty.
Hi there. Ken, thank you so much for your lecture. So many questions to start with, like both of my own and from the chat here. So maybe I'll start by asking about what seems to me a bit of a contradiction in some of Wilson's commitments. On the one hand, he cast a very wide net, and maybe he was pushed to do so by institutions, in his decision to represent African American culture. I was particularly moved by your comparison to the size of the African American population to those in Greece and in Canada. At the same time, you also were very explicit in the ways that August Wilson limited, at least like geographically, the scope of his plays, right, over decades of African American history to the Hill District in Pittsburgh. And so I'm wondering what's enabled, or maybe what other limitations are posed by that emphasis in the Hill District, and how you might be able to square that what would appear to be, right, a very constricting focus to Wilson's commitment to representing almost like the whole of African American culture.
Okay, I don't feel that a decision to focus on a particular district or a particular neighborhood should count as a restriction, and a limitation. I think what we've seen throughout the history of art is that many of the greatest artists, and whether you want to include, say, William Faulkner, for example, as a novelist who says he has focused his entire novelistic work on a postage stamp-sized portion of Mississippi, that it's possible, and I do think that Wilson shows this, to explore multiple, you could say an unlimited number of aspects of the human condition by focusing with intensity on one particular place or even one particular time. So I don't see that as a limitation at all. In fact, I see that it stands as a really kind of principle of not only dramatic art but novelistic art. The idea that by understanding as well as one can the particular, one does also understand the concerns that define us as human beings broadly.
And can I just follow that by asking another kind of tension between the general and specific? On the one hand, Wilson very committed to universal modes of representation. He'll cite Sophocles and other major Western figures as influences of his. At the same time, major advocate for agency and autonomy of African American culture production, very interested in the idiosyncrasies of what he and others would call almost quintessential African American representational forms. So I was thinking of that tension in relation to something that you pointed out about the Black arts movement, ways that its veneer of radicalism was in some ways compromised by some of its institutional affiliations. So could you also say a word about that relationship to a Black arts, Black power movement that's expressing cultural specificity and autonomy and agency, at the same time that Wilson, in identifying with that movement, also expresses a commitment in the ground in which I stand to universal Western representational forms?
I think there are several kinds of issues or questions sort of wrapped up within that. And Wilson, I do think, wrestles with a lot of contradictions that he never resolved. I mean, the point that I made by invoking Cedric Johnson is that there is no cultural representation that is adequate to the wide variety of the Black population in this country or across the world. So to the extent that anyone associated with the Black Arts Project, or to the extent that sometimes Wilson gives voice to that sensibility, it'll inevitably come up short. There's too much diversity, too much difference for there to be any one sort of cultural referent for that. The questions about, say, agency and autonomy are usually for me way too abstract to deal with on those terms. I do think sometimes, I mean, if you take it down to some of the questions that Wilson was really concerned about, which is to say, how do you get funding to mount a production to run a theater? Where does that funding come from? And to what extent do those who provide the funding exert control over what a theater can do? That's, I think, where what you were talking about are real sort of practical kinds of the practical kinds of questions, and it's a question that as I was trying to suggest here by discussing with bringing up some of Bruce Stein's point, it's a question that all nonprofit serious art theater contends with in some way, shape, or form. And so I do think that different kinds of issues are often entangled in the kind of question that you've raised here.
Thank you. Emily, did you want to add?
Well, I was thinking we should maybe bring in Ron and Charlie.
That would be wonderful. So if we can get Ron and Charlie on board here.
There they are.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I'm here.
This is the first time you had a chance to hear me on these matters. I did pose some questions for you, but rather than simply maybe toss that, I'll give you a chance to reflect.
Well, I can respond a little bit to what you have been saying, and the issue of the colorblind casting and things like that. It's a funny thing. There's a couple of specific questions in there that I saw, and was August against that and this and that. I think mainly the thing was we want to do our own stories. We want to tell our own stories, so we don't want to put those stories over our own culture. And a lot of times when plays are directed with quote unquote colorblind casting, it's a little different than what I call non-traditional casting. Now, I think those are different things. I say that because I say in non-traditional casting, there's a lot of plays that aren't about race or culture or family. And those I think can be, like, I give you an example, and Charlie knows what I'm getting ready to say. We did a play called Wait Until Dark. Now, Wait Until Dark was in the Village in the 60s, which it was a very cultural, diverse community. I was a young kid growing up in that time, and I saw all kinds of cultures. So why not have the blind woman, if people know the play, the blind woman is, we had her as Asian, her husband was Black, one of the cops was white, one was Black, the girl upstairs was Latino, so it was Latina. So it's a thing where I think there needs to be a conscious thought behind when you do a play where you're just plugging different races and different people in them. And you have to have a conscientiousness about directing them, because when you're directing them, I give you an example, Death of a Salesman, it's always talked about, you know, doing black versions and this and that. Now, I always say I was a salesman, I was door to door. And I would always say that, hey, being a salesman as a black person is 10, 15, 20 times worse than being a salesman regular. I had doors slammed on my face before I got on the end of the block because they heard there's this black guy getting ready to come by your house. Now that's a different thing than other plays. So you have to be strategic when you do that. And what August was saying, you know, is that, you know, when we put sometimes as actors, granted, he was all for all actors working, you know, I mean, you know, it's about working in this business. But I'm just saying that when you put that culture over your own culture to want to act, granted, you want to play Shakespeare and you want to do Eugene O'Neill, you want to do those, but you don't want to, in my opinion, now this is all just my opinion, you don't want to put that over playing the things that you can really sink your teeth into. And I know, again, I'm flipping around and going around, but the thought of the Chitlin circuit, I mean, I've had that discussion with a lot of people. Yeah, we have a viable, you know, the Chitlin circuit. And I used to say, yeah, well, I'm tired of chitlins. I want some steak, you know? And I think because I grew up eating chitlins, you know, I know what that's about. But I'm just saying that we want the same level and the same attention put to our own plays and our own stories from some of the major theaters and all that. That's all he was saying. And Henry Gates also got into a thing where, you know, that August still, his plays were done mostly in the major theaters and this and that. Of course, he was making a point, but when he started out, it wasn't like that. And also, even in his latter days, he did appreciate the smaller theaters that did his plays, you know, smaller black theaters. I'll give you an example. Congo Square Theater, which is a theater in Chicago, you know, a small equity theater. In August, we did the piano lesson, and we did it at a 77-seat house. And August told me, that's how I like to see my plays done. Now, granted, you're not going to make the money that you make at the big ones, of course, but that's when you can see the heart and the soul and the spirit that comes into doing those plays in your own community, amongst your own people. Those things happen like that. Now, granted, when people see them on a larger scale, they see that culture and that portrayal can be looked at universally. You can see how people can say, yeah, that's me and my dad, or that's me and my daughter, that's my son, that's how I treat, no matter what race you are. So I think they are universal in that way, but there is an essence about them that makes them pure in your own culture. And like, again, somebody had mentioned about Lorraine. Of course, we can't mention every playwright. Of course, Lorraine Hansberry is one of the key playwrights that did start and get things going. We could also talk about P.J. Gibson. We could talk about, like you did, Adrienne Kennedy, you know, Eulalie Spence from the 40s. You know, so there's a lot of people that contributed to what we have today. And as far as the black playwrights, of course, they're coming up and they're listening the same way August listened to those playwrights you mentioned, Ron Milner, Ed Bullins, Charles Fuller, those people that August read. So I don't say he was against, you know, colorblind casting necessarily, but, you know, you didn't want to put that over, you know, portraying our own cultures and making, you know, making a living being an actor, you know. So that's just one thought on that. I know I went off on a tangent, but I was chopping at the bit to get in there and say something. So thank you for letting me
go, Ron. Go, Ron.
Yeah, Charlie, I wonder if you have some thoughts on any of the aspects of that what Ron has said.
Well, just briefly, because I've learned so much from you, Ron, over our 15 years together. I don't think colorblind casting exists. How can one not? Race matters, as Wilson and others have said. So color conscious, I get, quote unquote, non-traditional, which is about opportunity and representation and inclusivity. But the best, one of the other examples, Ron, that maybe you could talk about is when you did Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, and you used the casting and the design and all of the tools that we have in the theater to tell a specific story, or to quote Tom Stoppard from earlier this week, a play is a text, but theater is an event. And we use all of the tools that we have, including casting. That production of Waiting for Godot that was set right here in the South Side. Well, you talk about it, please.
Well, I'll have to say that that's some non-traditional colorblind directing that you got going on there. You know, so we did have a different approach to it, but you know, we did take, in fact, when we did it, Ferguson was happening. So we put that in there. What are we waiting for? We're waiting for justice. We're waiting for peace, you know? We're waiting for some righteous behavior upon the establishment. All of those things came into play. You know, I Can't Breathe, you know, you saw it in those characters about what was happening to them. So again, that's what I mean about, you have to have consciousness about doing some of the great classic plays when you do them in a different way. You know, I just think it makes them deeper. It makes them stronger. It makes them, you know, sometimes people write plays, playwrights, Strindberg has written a lot of plays. I always love Strindberg. But when you do them now, if you were to do them now, even though they were written way back then, doing them now, they become deeper because you're bringing them in a different time period. You know, when I did The Caretaker at Writers Theater with a South Asian cast. And I know some people were like, that ain't what way. Hey, Pinter was a deep dude. Pinter would have loved seeing that. But of course, when he wrote it, he couldn't do that because, I mean, it wouldn't sell because, you know, people weren't ready for a change then, you know, and I don't know if they're ready for change now, but we're seeing if they are. But it was something that had a different kind of feel to it with those two actors. So a lot of times it's about the level and the competency of the actors that you have that can make it stronger. And I think if Pinter was alive and saw that, he would have said, hey, that was great. At the time he wrote it, there was a rioting going on among the Muslim community. So I think that he would have said, hey, right on, man, you know? So anyway, I'm just saying to say, you're right. It has to be consciousness in your character, but of course actors want to act. Don't get me wrong. I went to the University of Michigan. That's all we studied. Ibsen, Strindberg, you know, Chekhov, you know, so those were good. We had to do our own plays on our own on the side, but we learned from what we studied as far as, you know, the Stanislavski and the Meisners and, you know, things like that, you know, to get our own plays better. And that's what I mean when we were saying earlier about the Chitlin circuit. A lot of times it's about the technique. It's about your breathing properly. It's about speaking clearly, even if you're in dialect. If you're using your instrument properly, you can do that even better. So that's all I'm saying. It's about doing it all and being conscious about when you do cast a play, whether it's colorblind, non-traditional, whatever, you got to be conscious. You got to take an important look at who you're casting.
You know, there might be, you know, matters of terminological specificity here, or there may be some more substantive differences. Because one of the things that I'm hearing from Ron is
semantics.
Yeah, but it's, you know, that something like social specificity matters. That when
Yes.
when you mention, you know, your experience as a salesman, right? And
Yes.
to say, yeah, if you're going to do that, you would have to raise the question of how people are going to respond
Right.
when a person of a certain of a background
Right.
comes to their door, and there's going to be something different, and that will change, or potentially will change, their relationship
Right.
to, you know, to that role, however, you know, iconic it might be. And I think that you know, the point to go back to you know, the diversity within the Black community, right, would be the worry that people lose sight of that specificity when talking about matters among and between Black people, and instead allow cultural abstractions or loose assumptions to prevail, assuming the kind of a homogenization of experience, where what you get really, and you know, as we all know, you know, I don't know the Pittsburgh Hill District to the extent that I know it. I know it through Wilson's plays. Put it that way. And I think that's the question: is, you know, can we, the question that, that's, also here is, can we bring that kind of specificity, that kind of attention to detail to our internal investigation of the experiences of the Black population, rather than assuming a kind of, a general set of always operating principles and imperatives?
Well, like just what someone else was asking, I can't remember, but about the Hill District. Why, he's writing plays. He's writing what he knows. I mean, August he would just listen to people and feel, again, being a very spiritual person, a very poetic. He was a poet. All of those things come into play. And I would say that, again, culturally, that's one thing that can be brought to a play. If you, again, as I said, if you have a mixture of cultures in there, you got to talk about that in the rehearsal room. You got to, how would this culture react to this same situation? And you can bring that to your characters, and it makes it, again, we're looking to be as deep as we can be, And I think when you talk about the spirit and the ancestors, which August, always talks about relating and thinking and bringing in the ancestors into our work. We do that in the room. Whenever I'm directing August Wilson, it's the spirit in there. It's the spirit of him and the spirit of our ancestors that are in the room, And so that has to play. Some people don't see that and they don't feel that. So those are the things that I think, again, writing about what you know, especially as an early writer. I know when he was writing his early plays, he was so influenced by the blues and listening to the blues. And there was some comment about, the different. I was just going to say that, if we Bruce Steen, you were saying Bruce Steen was, knocking hip hop and this and that. Blues started from us, from the church, to the blues, to the field. We always had something going on. Even in the cabins of the slaves, we were doing our own entertainment, and then you get outside and they want you to do the minstrel shows, but that wasn't us, that wasn't what we wanted to do. No telling what we were doing back in the house. We were doing our own thing. So I'm just saying it is culture. You do need to maintain that specificity when you do these plays. And what August was saying is a lot of this funding money was going to the major theaters, of course. But what about it was going to theaters to develop their Black audience and letting the Black